We're going.
Okay. Hi, I'm Natalie.
Hi, I'm Holly.
Hi, I'm Kris.
And this is going to be our humanities presentation. Okay, let me just click over to it. All right. So we are going to be doing our humanities presentations on coal burns and Aboriginal fire burning. And it's by Holly, Kris, and Natalie.
So the place that we decided to use for our tuning in investigation and information session is based in a small town called Teesdale. The purpose of using this area was found from investigations of local areas that had Indigenous planned burns and the cultural significance to fire management. The community connection with the local fire brigade interconnects civics and citizenship in learning and can be combined with incursions at local schools from Indigenous representatives, local fire brigade people, or Department of Environment officers. This topic can be aligned with any area local to school students that has controlled burns. So whether you are local to Teesdale or there's any other local schools within, say, for example, the Ballard area that have access to areas that do controlled burns through the Department of Environment, there's ways that you can use this tuning in investigation in those places. So the lesson that we created for the students was from Cool Australia, and it is called Coal Burning Using Fire to Manage Country for Upper Primary Students, and the link is just there. I took some pictures of an area that had a Indigenous cultural planned burn just in Teesdale in an area called Baker's Lane, and it was done in March 2017. You'll see a video that we show later on in our presentation of the actual controlled burn that they had using Indigenous fire practices, and it was planned again for March this year, but obviously was cancelled because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Kris, you're up.
Sorry, my internet's been a little bit slow, but so I'm going to give a summary of the presentation. And today, during this presentation, we're going to look at the overview of cultural burns. So when we're talking about cultural burns, we might be talking about coal burns that are that are done using Indigenous practices. So we're talking about why they are important and why they're significant in Australia, how they're culturally significant and how they're utilised. This presentation will give teachers an explanation as to why cultural burns are an important aspect of the humanities and geography curriculum. It will also provide teachers with examples on how to teach this topic to students at a grade 5 to 6 level. There will be a tuning in aspect, which will cover why we chose this topic, how it is culturally rich, and how students can benefit from understanding the content. And there will be an immersive experience which will focus on the tuning in and the teaching of this component, as well as a lesson plan that could be used for teaching this lesson.
Okay, so some of the Victorian curriculum that we went over and we linked to this lesson and this lesson plan is history. So for the levels 5 and 6, so we looked into Australia as a nation. So significant contributions of individuals and groups, including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and migrants to changing Australian society. Also to explain the causes of significant events that shaped the Australian colonies, so that contributed to the Australian Federation and the effects of these on the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and then the migrants. We also linked it into science. So the scientific understandings, discoveries, and inventions that were used to inform personal and community decisions and to solve problems that directly affect people's lives. So we really linked that to the fire burning and to the Australian bushfires that happened. We also talked about geography, so the influence on people, including the influence of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on the environmental characteristics of Australian places. Civics and citizenship was also linked in. So the investigate how people with shared beliefs and values work together to achieve their goals and plan for action. So this will be linked later in our lesson plan, but it was also linked in for our tuning in.
So the teaching strategies that we covered within our lesson plan and for the purpose of this tuning in investigation was through the understanding and the reasoning behind fire management and its link to cultural significance. We covered all of the teaching strategies basically. Multiple exposures through informative videos and a visit of the site, or there's a possible chance to visit the site, and if that is not possible, then being able to use relevant special guests such as people in the fire brigade or environmental officers, or even Indigenous representatives from the local area. We used questioning in the lesson plan to, I used to think and now I think, so getting the students to really use their metacognitive strategies in what they used to think to leading into what they now think based on their interpretation of some photos. Feedback was obviously constant classroom discussion. So getting kids to talk about what they felt and what they thought and what they now think, obviously, which was through the questioning as well. The differentiated teaching, obviously at grade 5 level, or grade 5, 6 level, we were approaching this tuning in or the lesson at that level. We tried to include as much differentiated teaching as possible through, students working in groups, individually, working by drawing, also using informative videos, and then the teacher doing explicit teaching through having background knowledge of some Indigenous traditions, of Indigenous fire management traditions. The worked examples, what could be done is give a demonstration of the final report for the students to see, which is what they would be doing as part of their lesson. Again, collaborative learning. Students were working in small groups to complete their report, so there needed to be collaborative learning for the students to discuss with each other the strategies that we use for Indigenous fire management.
Okay, so discussing how the humanities discipline is reflected. So the humanities discipline is reflected through the different parts of the humanities curriculum that's involved in this lesson. So we use specific parts of the history, geography, and civics and citizenship from the Victorian curriculum, and we covered that. So for history, the history curriculum is reflected in the lesson plan by looking at the significant contributions of individuals and groups, by including the Aboriginals of the land. So how those significant events then affected the colonies and how that affects the Aboriginals. So this lesson looked into the burning of the land and why it was occurred, and pushing those students to really make those connections. When looking at the geography links to these lessons talk about the influence of the Aboriginal and Indigenous people on the environment. So it links to the firing of the land and what may have occurred. So civics and citizenship. So the Victorian curriculum links for civics and citizenship is to investigate how people with shared beliefs and values work together to achieve these goals. Now, when we're looking at the Teesdale site later on this video, it shows how different people all work together to attain this goal. And after the bushfires that recently happened at the start of the year, there was a lot of talk about how we could incorporate firemenning back into the fire measures to help lessen the bushfires that we have, and how we can take a different approach and really incorporate those Aboriginal ways back in. So the civics and citizenship is really reflected in this lesson through that joint goal and working towards at the Teesdale site. Let's skip that one.
So some recommended resources that we have found to help with sort of further learning and to connect with our tuning in. A few of them, there are a lot of great resources that we've used in the lesson plan, which we'll go through shortly. But one of the ones, two of the ones that we've used for this in particular come from Cool Australia. Now, we've used this first link a lot to inspire us with the lesson plan and the basis of our tuning in. And the second link provides some great information about fire management that is aimed for students to an upper primary or lower secondary level that give a lot of great information on sort of the history of Indigenous fire management and some sort of goes through explicitly some of the practices that are used. So it's a great resource there. And these next two we've used, they were found in the Cool Australia activity, the first one. And they're really great to sort of delve a little bit further into this activity. The first one there is North Australian Indigenous Land and Sea Management Affiliation. So they go into how they've looked after the land and the sea over the last few hundred or even thousands of years, and how that can be incorporated into sort of modern life now and things like that. Now the second one is the second one is about tracking bushfires mainly in North Australia, but it does go down a little bit further as well. That's about tracking bushfires, whether they're hot or cold, and checking the difference between the two, and seeing if there are any planned bushfires sort of around my region in the near future coming up. Now, due to the prominence of bushfires in Australia recently, there have been a lot of articles published on the internet about the importance of cultural burns. So I've got two examples down here taken from the ABC website that have been published recently. Now, these can be used to give teachers or students some more information. The first one here is Cultural Burns to Victoria, return to Victoria after 170 years in hope of revitalising the land. So this one goes on about how Indigenous practices haven't sort of been used much in Victoria and how they should be used, and sort of what they can do and the Indigenous people's sort of attitude towards it. And I've just got a quote here which is really sort of explains the entire attitude from an Indigenous perspective. And it says, one of the roles of non-Aboriginal people is to enable and build capability and then just get out of the way. So this shows the attitude of Indigenous groups towards cool burns and cultural burns. Now, the second one is about Indigenous fire practices that have been used to quell bushfires for thousands of years. So this one's a little bit of the opposite of the first one, and that goes into a particular region that has utilised Indigenous fire practices over many years and how that's impacted the land. So these two articles would be great for further learning and sort of maybe an extra sort of activity for students to sort of delve into the way that it's utilised in different places.
All right, here's the Teesdale video that we talked about before. Oh.
We as Aboriginal people have the right to maintain our culture. To maintain distinctive spirit and material economic relationship with land, water and other resources, the fish, the traditional laws and customs. To us as Aboriginal people, fire is connected to our healing, to our cultural identity, and to maintenance of country. And that's for all of us Aboriginal people. It's one of those universal things that we have across all of our multi-nations of country across Australia. Fire is one of those things that we do share in common.
Fire for me has always been about big organisation, big risk and fear.
To me, this is what should be happening with everyone. We have Tamarong here, we have Wurundjeri. Have them on company as well. That is so important because we're learning together. We have people here who aren't from this country but look after it as well. So we need to give them the knowledge. People here that aren't Indigenous, that have an interest in the environment and looking after country, we need to give them the knowledge as well.
For Delp and my role, this is what we're all about. This is what we're aiming to do. So working with the traditional owners as in a partnership, not as stakeholders. They are our partners and we work with them. This is a different way of engaging the community and traditional owners, and it's really about their aspirations, what they want to come out of these projects. And not only working with the traditional owners, but with our Aboriginal community as well.
And I hope the partnerships between DELP and parks and CMAs grow and foster this, because our traditional owners around Victoria are saying this is vital. This is so vital to ensure we have healthy country.
The whole driver for this is bringing back the health of country and seeing it intermingled with the science and the experience that we have. I think it's just great potential opportunities I think we have. It's actually behind the way being delivered. It's actually about caring. It's about mental health. And we as land managers also want to do that too, but to actually be embedded as the part of culture and for traditional owners and how their connection with country, it actually makes observing what's happening today almost more meaningful.
We need to empower TOs and community to be able to do planned burns, to be able to use our skills and knowledge to manage this land, to heal this land, so that as people, we can be healed as well. So we need to work together to be able to heal country and to be able to practice cultural burns where we can, CFA burns where we can, as long as it heals country.
So today, we're learning and we're changing the way that people think. And that's what we're trying to do. Healthy country, happy people. So that's what we want our country to be. We want it to be happy. We want the plants and the grasses, the trees to be healthy as well. When we're at Yunganamala, the fire spirit has come back. I think it's, a real honour and a privilege to be doing this. And I'm sure my ancestors will be proud of us all here today. So thanks for that.
So part of our lesson plan, we obviously level 5 and 6 with the discipline of geography. Our time frame was about 50 minutes, and the other disciplinary content in this lesson was science, history, civics and citizenships. So the overview students will learn about the cultural benefits and planned burns and how Indigenous Australians use fire to manage different areas. They build an understanding of how traditional fire management practices, including mosaic burns, are conducted. They're to compare cool burns with the more damaging wildfires that occur later in the season. Obviously, talking about our summer times. And the conclusion, they are able to explain how traditional fire management is used to protect the ecology of varied environmental areas. That's part one.
Okay, so part two of the lesson plan goes through the Victorian curriculum statements and the links to the curriculum. So as we can see here, and as was mentioned above, there are quite a lot of links to the curriculum. These include history and Australia as a nation. So part of this would be students will look at significant contributions of individuals and groups, including Australian and Torres Strait Islander peoples and migrants to changing Australian society. So how Indigenous groups contribute to Australia and Australian society, and mainly the environment. It will explain the causes of significant events that shaped Australian colonies, contributed to Australian Federation, and the effects of these on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people. So we'll also go through science and science as a human endeavour. So scientific understandings, discoveries, and inventions are used to inform personal and community decisions, and to solve problems that directly affect people's lives. So that being obviously bushfires and the controlled burns, which control bushfires in particular regions. So we also look at geography and the factors that shape places and influence interconnections. So influence of people, including the influence of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, Torres Strait Island people, and on the environmental characteristics of Australian places. So once again, similar to the science, how geographical places shape, how we shape the environment and how the environment shapes us. And of course, citizen and citizenship, which looks at diversity and identity. So we will investigate how people with shared beliefs, values work together to achieve their goals and plan for actions. So how we listen to Indigenous groups' advice on cultural burnings and how that can impact us as a diverse community.
So for the lesson plan, so part 3 of it talked about the educational goals for the learning intention for this presentation. So its students can identify the environmental impacts through learning about how Indigenous people use fire to manage their country. So understanding and visiting those local areas to the students with significant Indigenous fire burning techniques, so cultural burns. So the key concepts for this lesson, so the definition, you've got cultural burns. So traditional fire management applies cool and quick burns. So these low intensity fires are known as cultural burning, as we saw in that video before. So they have several benefits. So it saves the flora and the fauna. So animals, including beetles, ant colonies, they have time to escape. Younger trees can survive, and the fire can keep those grass seeds intact for regrowth. So the heat, which is much cooler than the hazard reduction burn, doesn't ignite the oil in the tree's bark. So it's a tool for gardening the environment. So self-extinguishing. So the fire extinguishes itself straight after it burns the grass. So it doesn't then catch fire of the trees like we see in bushfires. So it avoids the weed killers. So introduced species, for example, the grasses are not fire resistant and they can be removed with fire instead of chemicals. So other vocab for this lesson is cool burns, Indigenous Australians, wildfire, bushfire, prescribed burns, seasons, adaptation, savanna, and ecology. Natalie.
Thank you. So part of the lesson, the key questions that we had for the students was, what is a cool burn and what is the difference between a hot and a cool burn? What are some of the problems with hot burns, and how would you describe what a mosaic burn is? What are the purposes of these types of burns? So all these sort of questions are what we wanted to give to the students to help them really question what they were learning and have a really good understanding. So by doing that, all of the information that the students are able to gather on cultural burns is through a couple of videos and some class discussion with some prompted questions. Obviously, some of the questions are part of that. In the second part of the lesson, or in a second lesson, the students are organised in groups, and each group, they compile a report about how and why Indigenous Australians use fire to manage the country. So basically, using the key questions for the lessons, they're able to investigate and help answer those questions. There's relevant worksheets that we found to use within the lesson. And then obviously we wanted to introduce the video of the local Indigenous burn as our tuning in for the students, so that there's connection from what they were learning and being able to see the significance of the importance of it. And then obviously if the students weren't able to, which they wouldn't be able to physically observe unless they were doing it in their own time with their parents from a distance, when we're not in a COVID-19 lockdown, some other suggestions would be to have, like I said earlier, some representatives from either the Fire Brigade or Natural Resources and Environment, or even some Aboriginal Indigenous people to come and talk to the students.
Okay, so the materials that would need to be used for this lesson include the internet, a student worksheet, which is linked here, digital projector or smartboard. They'll need a fact sheet on how do Indigenous Australians use fire, and the info sheet on Indigenous Australians using fire to care for the country. So the introduction will only take about 5 or so minutes, and the learning intention there is to identify the environmental impacts through learning about how Indigenous people use fire to manage their country. So students will be seated on the floor. Students will be introduced to the learning intention and the topic of the lesson, which is cool burns. And then we've got another link here for the resources on Indigenous Australian and fire management. And there is some assessment here which is formative, and that will include asking questions.
All right, so the next part is the students will be doing their Think, See, Wonder. So they'll be watching the cool burn videos. So you've got your 2 videos there, and this will take about 15 minutes. So these key questions that you're going to be asking the students is, what is the difference between a hot burn and a cool burn? And what are some of the problems with those hot burns? So those students will have a worksheet printed out for them, and it will be attached up in the presentation. And the assessment looked at is formative. So I used to think, but now I think, so prompting that questioning to be written in the workbook before and after each of the video and on the worksheets. So our next part is that students will be broken up into groups of about 3 students. So each of these groups will compile a report about how and why Indigenous Australians use fire to manage country. So they'll be using the inquiry questions that will be posted below, 300 words about and a drawing of an outline of the habitat. And then they'll be creating 3 copies. So they'll colour one before the fire season, one after a cool burn, and then one after a hot burn. And teachers will have those printed out pictures of the savanna habitat. So there's very small pictures of them just there. So the assessment is that students will be working together on these in groups collaboratively. So linking back to that collaborative learning. And so with the end result progressing over a few lessons. This won't just be for this lesson.
So this part of the lesson, which is sort of just explaining to the students about how they'll be working in their groups, again, using some topic questions that we'd be asking them, why are cool burns necessary, just prompting them through that part of the lessons. They'll create 2 checklists that they'll use as tools to help their investigation. Within the group, roles within each group, the students can have a choice to have these particular roles within the group if they want to, and then have a checklist on when the conditions are right and was the cool burn successful. There's all of the worksheets for these in a link, and it's basically all helping the students to understand how they're working through to work on the report that will be done over a few sessions. And again, the assessment is working collaboratively together with the worksheets, finding out information, and asking the teacher if there was any questions, and also referring back to the videos that we watched, that the students had watched earlier. The assessment of the lesson and the intentions for the assessment, as noted before, they'll be working in groups and have a chance to compile all the information and put it together in either a Word document, a Prezi, a PowerPoint, or a video, or even a podcast. So the students have a chance to present their report in a way that they get to choose.
Okay, so with the main assessment, there is a rubric here listed. Now, there is a few different criteria here for students to reach, and they include showing their knowledge of Indigenous knowledge to manage and how they manage the environment. They'll also have to describe the relationships between climate and environment, and show their knowledge of the relationship between climate, weather, and fire, processing and analysing data and information. So that will suggest how the investigation can be modified to improve the outcome. Students will then show their support, show their point of view about Indigenous burning practices, and the communication of the project. So they'll have their checklist and how they've gone through, modified, edited, printed, and used by people planning cool burns.
All right, so that is the end of our presentation on our lesson plan, and thank you very much for watching.